professionals talk about instruction, they're more likely to talk about intervention and vice versa. Next slide, please, Lori. So a couple of key features here. If we're going to talk about progress monitoring, once again, we collect developmental information on how the child is approaching achieving his IEP objectives only on those priority goals. So that's part of the process of MEPI. We are once again looking at an inclusive type classroom with varying ratios of typical to developing to children with IEPs. However, in many cases, we're looking at somewhere between 8 and 16 kids. And if the teacher has somewhere between 2 and 8 of these children with IEPs, at least in the initial rollout of the model, we have to be concerned about how much time and effort she can devote to addressing IEP objectives. That's why we go through the process of MEPI to determine which objectives the teacher needs to address intentionally versus objectives that are likely to be supported as a result of maturational, environmental, and peer engagement. So once again, the data collection, we're focusing on priority IEP objectives. Data should be collected regularly on these objectives, and regularly means something like after 10 days of instruction, okay? Not necessarily 10 calendar days, because as you know, these kids come and go. So 10 days of instruction, 40 days would be too long. 3 days would, unless it's a behavior like self-injurious behavior or some other behavior that is not going to win the friendship and favor of his peers, we're not going to monitor the child's progress every few days. And the last piece is that each IEP goal does not need to be monitored, hence the suggestion that you focus on priority goals. Every now and then we run into a teacher who insists that their supervisor says that every IEP objective of every child in their classroom has to be monitored every day. And our general thoughts about that is it never happens. It's a complete fantasy and it's a disservice. So let's be real with each other. Let's focus on the IEP objectives that are important and let's focus on measuring those. Next slide, please.
I agree, Bill. I think as far as that goes, in terms of what we look at, is we just want to make sure that you're able to monitor the child's progress and report on that progress. That's what IDEA says. Nowhere does it say that you have to measure those IEP goals on a daily basis.
Yeah. And since you raised that point, Suzanne, we also, it's important to differentiate between monitoring and teaching. Teaching is not monitoring. Monitoring is not teaching. So the monitoring is the evidence that the teaching is effective, but you can't spend more time monitoring than you're spending teaching. So I think we could agree on that. Who should participate in paying attention to the child's progress toward achieving his IEP objectives? Certainly the itinerant early childhood special ed teacher, the early childhood education partner, related services staff, parents where appropriate, and teacher assistants, paraeducators where appropriate. Next slide, please. And why is that? Well, you know, if we want to engage other individuals who are primary in the life of this particular child, once again, this model is driven by the fact that consulting teachers, itinerant teachers, related services professionals don't have enough time to devote to this child, but during their absence, there's another competent adult who, with the systematic transfer of knowledge and skills, could address those IEP objectives. So the issue becomes one of ownership and shared responsibilities. We want to communicate that message, that we are a team, and in fact, everybody on the team has some responsibility for ensuring the child is making progress. And one of the ways that we commit ourselves to this team is to make an effort to engage our partner, whether it's a parent or the early childhood gen ed teacher or the paraeducator, in helping to document the child's progress. So once again, respecting the significant effect of these adults on the development of the child, it's an absolute necessity, and it's just simply the reality we've talked about. They're going to have much more interaction time with the child than you are. And also the test of whether or not this transfer of knowledge and skills has been effective. And the bottom line, as they say, is the advancement of the child. No matter what we do in terms of our, the front loading, the systematic transfer of knowledge and skills, the only way that has any effect is whether or not the child is evidencing progress toward achieving their IEP objectives. If we're not seeing that progress, we have to go back and take a look at that knowledge and skill. Next slide, please. Yeah, we are. This is probably a bad metaphor from Arizona, but you have a few bodies of water there, right? So I've been told. We're all in the same boat. We're all in the same desert buggy. That might work better. But yeah, you get the idea. That's the message we're trying to communicate. We need to engage our partners. They're critical in the development of this child, and we do that through a number of different things, including an attempt to engage them in active monitoring of the child's progress. Next slide, Lori. Yeah, this is topical to this slide because we just launched those 4 astronauts yesterday. Crazy Elon Musk up at it again, right? So yeah, we're looking at the big board there. Next slide. We're not going to look once again at all the detailed opportunities for monitoring child progress. There's way too much information, but I've buried a whole lot of it in a folder on the Edmodo site. So once again, if you want to rise to the bait, there's a whole lot of stuff in there, a lot of forms, an overview of the rationale for different types of monitoring systems. So in this particular case, let's just look at levels of support as an issue, which is particularly appropriate for some of your kids who may have more significant delays. It's not just a matter of all or none or the child proceeding from step 1 to step 7 without any form of assistance. We can see progress by looking at lesser degrees of support necessary for the child to demonstrate that particular skill or behavior. So there's a couple of different ways we can win. And so we look at prompting strategies, how we adapt the materials and environment, and changes our expectation for performance based on the skill level and competencies of the child. So we can gauge progress over time by saying at this time the child can do more than he could do. He needs less intensive and less frequent and less intrusive forms of support in order to demonstrate this skill. Next slide. As I mentioned, this recognizes the severity of long-term disability condition. You may have some kids who end up at your front door, so to speak, who have significant physical and sensory and cognitive impairments, which suggest that these conditions are going to require some support for the rest of their lives. This doesn't mean that we absolve ourselves of any responsibility for the kids making progress. What it means is we have to look differently at what progress might look like. So we recognize some kids may have great difficulty in executing some task without some level of assistance. And some kids will need support to participate in inclusive activities. Absolutely. Next slide, Lori. Before I talk about frozen records, that last piece, there are some sample forms which talk about level of prompting as indicators of progress, which are once again embedded in the folder on the Edmodo site, which I think is clearly labeled progress monitoring or some variation on the theme. So here's another way you can keep track of how our friends are responding to our interventions, or more importantly, to your gen ed teacher partner's intervention and instruction. We look at frozen records, permanent products, which is something that I'm sure you're all familiar with in terms of portfolios. We actually capture some type of product the child produces, which we can identify as having occurred on a certain day and observed by a certain person. The product can actually be something like a drawing, some construction of the child, sculptures, artwork, etc. Or it could be a product, or it could be a photo of an activity, or an audio or video. Excuse me. Telemarketers. It could be an actual, they'll be done in a second, audio or video recording of the child engaged in the process of completing a task or activity.
Where's it?
Next slide, Lori. By the way, my suggestion on the previous slide was always date and initial your permanent products. And this, the short version of the moth story hour, since you raised that, Suzanne, is that in the unlikely event that something comes to due process, there's nothing worse than getting a cardboard box full of a child's products that are undated and uninitialed, and somebody suggesting that this would represent the child's work in kindergarten. It's really tough to assemble that jigsaw puzzle. So for everybody's benefit, if we're going to document a child's progress, we need to document the date we saw this observed and who did the observation. Next slide, please. So yeah, here's a pretty good example. This slide says in the bottom of the slide that this child is demonstrating he's able to stack 6 1-inch cubes in 3 minutes and 25 seconds. So pretty straightforward. He does in fact have 5 cubes stacked up, and the physics suggest they might take a 6th block. As you can see, they're not, symmetrically stacked, but they're still, they're balanced, okay? So what this little guy is communicating in terms of his cognitive development and his fine motor skills, when you started with him in September, he might have been a 3-block kid, or a 3-block kid if you really hurried up because it was going to fall. And now, once again, maturation, environmental opportunities, maybe 9 months later, this is what we have, which could be the target of that IEP objective. So the specifics are clear. These are 6 1-inch cubes, which makes a difference. They could be 4 2-inch cubes, not the same task. They could be 8 3/4-inch tubes, clearly not cubes, not the same task. And we may have a fluency requirement that his IP objective said, because we're not interested in him becoming a professional block stacker. What we're interested in here is fluency, understanding the principles of balance and being able to execute the fine motor task that demonstrates that in a period of time that would suggest that this is not the acquisition phase. This child may be in some form of fluency. If this takes him 12 minutes, that's a different task. If he can Rubik Cube this thing in 30 seconds, that would be really impressive, right? We don't really need to shoot for those kind of targets on either end, actually. But once again, this is a very quick way to keep track of kids' progress. And in this particular case, this is a way for the gen ed teacher not to be overwhelmed with somebody asking her to run around the room with a clipboard. All you're asking you to do is take a cell phone shot of this kid when he's almost done with the task or completed the task, and noting the time it took and what the materials were. Next slide, Lori. This is something that you're all familiar with, a task analysis, and we can use task analyses once again to help our gen ed partners understand how children can be making progress. So in this particular case, somebody's broken hand washing down into 7 steps. It could be 15 steps, that's probably too many. Could be 3, I think that'd be too few. So we'll settle like Goldilocks, we'll settle for 7 steps, okay? It's a start. Next slide. Magic. So here are 3 of the 4 steps in sequence. And once again, this is something that some of you are already familiar with and working with, but we just simply leave this for the partner teacher or a parent or a paraeducator to show him or her the sequence that this child should engage in to appropriately wash his hands. For some unknown reason, I can't find step 4. I don't know what happened to it. It's disappeared forever. But 5, 6, and 7 are back. So we now have, the 7 steps in washing your hands. If we start this activity in September, and this child can only complete the first 2 steps, or step 1 or step 3 out of the 7, and we work with him, and at some point in, let's call it November, he's able to complete 4 out of 7 steps, that's 57%. That's a pretty good gain. I think the odds are good for most of your kids over the course of certainly an academic year. We'd want them to complete all those steps. And God knows hand washing is in, right? It's got to be like number 2 on every kid's IEP list of hand washing. Covering your mouth is 1, and then hand washing is 2. Yeah, so maybe that's a good outcome, so to speak. We'll have the most hygienic preschool kids in the history of the United States. Next slide, please. So you can take any task, before we go into scaling, by the way, and break it down into subtasks, and you have yourself set up from soup to nuts. Here's step 1, here's step 9. My initial observations suggest this kid is typically at step 2. Anywhere between 2 and 9 is a win. The more significantly delayed the kid is, the fewer opportunities he has for practicing of a skill in the environment outside of the classroom. Maybe my expectations are he moves from step 2 to step 5. That's a big win. For a kid who is quite competent, who may have multiple opportunities in class as well outside of class, maybe I'm thinking he's more likely to hit 7 or 8. But the point being, it's all immediately obvious, and our gen ed teacher has a clear understanding of what to be looking for as this child masters this particular task. Okay, last time around we promised we'd talk about a platform for assessment called goal attainment scaling. Next slide, Lori. The point being here that some children, and in this case also kids with significant disabilities, we wouldn't expect them to experience the same trajectory of development as their peers. But we can once again observe progress as children move from one stage in this goal attainment scaling to another. And we can get rid of the all or none kind of an outcome where everybody has to move from something less than 85 to 85% for mastery. If you have kids that are at the 10 or 15 or 20%, it may not be reasonable based on, once again, their skills and their opportunities to expect they'll move to 85 to 100%. But if they move to 65% from 25%, that's a significant improvement. We don't want to not recognize that. So goal attainment scaling gives us that possibility. Next slide, Lori. So the first thing we do is we look at the child's current function. We look at what we would accept as appropriate progress or reasonable progress, and we look at what we would look at as being progress that is beyond what we might typically expect. Next slide, Lori. Now, this is the more typical goal attainment scaling model, and I'll address that with and then there'll be a slight caveat. In this case, they put expected outcome as a 0. That's the valence they give it. And in this case, it's talking. The first example is going to be a therapeutic intervention. So before we start with any interventions, the expected outcome is established. In this case, they generate a -1 and a -2 score. So this means as a result of intervention, if the child is later identified as having been at a -1 level, it means their performance is less than we'd expect the intervention. If he goes to a +1, it means that the performance is greater than we expected, and a +2 is much greater. Okay. My caveat is forget the minuses and the pluses. The minuses serve more of a clinical function than they do an educational function, and most of us don't want to go down that negative road. So if you take the current level of performance and put it at 1, and then the subsequent levels, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. That's probably a better way to approach this goal attainment scaling. But you see you can deconstruct the acronym goal. We can agree on what that is. You know, the goal is somewhere beyond the current level of performance. We're not looking toward less than the current level, but we're looking for grades of improvement beyond current level of performance. Attainment is, after a period of time, exactly what level of advanced performance has the child attained, and the scale being, has he moved from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Okay, so pretty straightforward. It's more of like, how would I put this? It's like a mindset, so to speak, in terms of having these different scales for performance versus specific numerical targets like 20%, 30%, 4 out of 5, etc. Next slide, please. So let's take our little friend here. You know, Lori, when I see this photo, I think of the bridge at Wildwood, but there must be a lot of bridges just like that, huh?
Yeah, you might be right.
That's a large park near us, but in any event. Next slide, please. In this particular little girl's case, we're looking at her mobility and her gait trainer. You know, her current performance that's identified as baseline is she walks to the lunch table less than 1 time a week. expected outcome, the therapist determined that twice a week, and this is all interesting because part of the issue is where do you start when you walk to the lunch table? If you happen to be over in zone 5 in the corner near the window and the lunch table is zone 1, it's a longer walk than zone 3, but that's a conversation for another day. The beauty of being in a classroom is you actually are in a confined space. You're in an 18 by 42 foot long room, and you actually sometimes have 1-inch square vinyl tiles, depending on the age of your classroom. It's really easy to figure out where these kids are going. And you have, kind of informal monitoring of, well, she's over there, and for her to get from here to there is approximately 22 feet. So we have some kind of an idea of the child's performance. But in this case, we're looking at frequency of moving to the table. So as the child improves her use of her gait trainer, the number of times she moves to the table during the weekend, we're going to consider this to be unprompted, perhaps, other than simply saying, hey, Diana, it's time for snack. We see evidence of progress. There's another side to this, too. I don't think we have an OT in the group. We got a bunch of speech language pathologists, but there's also a quality issue. Since we're looking at a gait trainer, it's not just simply how quickly she gets to the table or whether she gets there without falling over. It can be the quality of the gait, which is a whole other dimension. So you could actually have two different levels of evaluation here. One is simply the functional level. She gets from here to there, and she does it more frequently than she can do it now. The second level would be the quality, and that would be easy to rate as a plus minus or, as an equal sign like no significant change, minus gait is less proficient than it should be, and plus is good quality gait. And once again, this is directed toward your gen ed partner teacher. So are these the kinds of things she could notice and record? And I think the answer is yes. These are kind of big chunks of this little girl's life, whether she gets to the table, snack table or lunch table, on any one of the 4 to 5 days a week she's in class. Not a lot of heavy lifting. All the teacher has to do is figure out some little mnemonic to just simply take a note of whether Diana made it to the lunch table without assistance today. Next slide, Lori. Here's our little friend here, Javier. He's got a toothbrush. No, he's got a yogurt in front of him with a spoon, or maybe a toothbrush, maybe both. Yogurt with a toothbrush. Next slide, please. It's happened, right? It's happened before. So whatever this activity is, we'll stick with the yogurt. We'll stick with the completion of reasonable time without excessive spillage or excessive time consumed, excessive help. Same kind of a deal with goal attainment scaling. Expected outcome, and then what are the other stages that would suggest to us that he's improving? So we could look at spillage, and we could look at time. So for a 4-year-old kid who has some problems, let's say with being on task, remaining in his seat, fluency with respect to completing a task, how long would it take him to eat one of these little 4-ounce yogurt cups? I don't know. 20 minutes? Nah, probably too long. 30 seconds? We got some heartburn or GERD coming up with that kind of diet. So, we discuss some kind of reasonable expectation. Maybe he starts out that within 4 minutes, and then we're looking at 3 minutes, 2 minutes. But you get the idea. Relatively easy for a gen ed teacher to follow these kinds of instruction for monitoring. And, we go 10 slides back. Don't do it, Lori, but 10 slides back. We're all in the same boat. What we're trying to do here is offer a gen ed teacher an opportunity to participate in monitoring whether the child's making progress without unduly burdening her. So no stopwatch required, okay? No hovering over the kid, just some expectations for what she should be looking for as the child improves his performance in this particular skill. Next slide, Lori. Yeah, as I threatened before, there actually is stuff in that Edmodo folder, and a lot of detail and a lot of forms. And whatever we stick up there, you guys feel free to download and edit and do what you'd like with it. We don't have a copyright, neither does Brooks, so on that stuff. So feel free. Okay, Lori, thank you.
Yeah, so let's just talk about progress monitoring just a little bit more from the perspective of helping teachers or thinking about strategies to help gen ed teachers collect data and some of the challenges that might be involved in that. I wonder if anybody has any questions or that. And I don't have access to the chat room, so Susie, maybe you could, if there are people that chime in or whatever. But I'd be really interested to kind of talk about that because I think it's important. Data collection and progress monitoring is often a huge issue for people, and we need to make sure that we're being realistic in terms of supporting teachers. Or maybe it's not an issue in Arizona.
Sorry, what help with my unmuting myself.
There you go.
Let's see. So someone asked, could we be using the teaching strategies goal? That's realistic. And that was another comment earlier, is that many of our teachers do a great job of documenting children's progress using teaching strategies, whether they're taking pictures and uploading those or putting in notes and uploading those relative to, the age appropriate and expected skills that all kids are engaged in learning.
Yep. I would suggest that going back and making sure that there is a relationship between the IEP objective and the goals and objectives and teaching strategies gold or some kind of curriculum like that would be a move that could save you some time and effort. Because I totally agree with you. I think that being able to see that and capitalize on data collection that you're already doing is a good thing. That may or may not be so for some kids with disabilities, but it may also be true. So yeah, I'd say go for it. Anybody else have any other comments?
Yeah, just to say that, well, somebody else might be thinking about a comment. The challenge here is, regardless of teaching strategies gold or whatever, there's your side of the equation. That would be the Arizona LEAs. Your side of the equation in terms of what kinds of data monitoring you do to meet your requirements to the Arizona Department of Ed. On the other side of the equation is what kinds of monitoring is reasonable for your partner teacher. In some cases, in some of your LEAs, those are your employees. But in a rollout, in 2-3 years, whatever, it's possible you might be out there with Head Start people who are not your employees. They may or may not be. You may be out there with child care providers. You may be out there with preschool teachers and community-based preschool programs. To the extent that the teaching strategies gold can generalize to those environments with your what's the word here, smoothing it out for them, that's good. The only issue I think we could agree on is that when we roll this out to people that are not special educators, who are not necessarily interested or not necessarily experienced in monitoring child behavior at the kind of precision we need for IEPs, we need to roll it out one IEP objective at a time, one monitoring strategy at a time, and just gradually add to the system. And be sensitive to when the system might be a little overheated. So yeah, that's the issue. To the extent that teaching strategies gold is easily transferable and is the standard for your district, that would be the best way to go.
Just to add to, the best report to do that on teaching strategies gold from the LEA to the general education or to your partner teacher is the development and learning report on there. So if you guys are looking for a quick way to do it, that would be the report to run.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it would be if I were the publisher of Teaching Strategies Gold, I think I would take a look to see how well the data collection targets align with possible IEP objectives. It'd be really interesting to be able to look at that. And I think it would be a great selling point for inclusive early childhood programs.
Yep. Yeah, just a final statement that to the extent that we can avoid it, we don't want to get involved in data systems that are different or that are more. We want our data systems to match across settings, and we want our data systems to be as transparent and as manageable as possible. Once again, keeping in mind the experiences and time limitations of our gen ed partners.
Any other questions or comments about progress monitoring?
I was going to say, I think there are some good checklists and those kinds of things out there that describe the different interventions and your ability to like check off that we did this or the child is performing in this way. So there's some things that are out there already, right?
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Yeah, some of the stuff in the Edmodo folder is stuff that was out there that, we have just fiddled with and recalibrated and stuck in there. Yeah, there's plenty of stuff. Some of it, in my opinion, I don't want to clog up the works here, but some of the stuff is, in my opinion, too detailed for general ed partners. Some of the behavioral stuff is just a little too comprehensive. So I think you'll know that when you see it.
Great.
Lori?
Okay, ready to switch topics now for something completely different. We talked about progress monitoring and kind of the steps of the model, and by now we've gone through all of the steps of the model that Bill and I kind of talk about in the book. One of the important topics that we have not addressed, and we think about tools and tricks of the trade, is how important people skills are to the process of providing effective itinerant services from a consultative approach. And so in this next section, we want to talk a little bit about understanding how partnerships develop. We want to talk about the topics related to social power and influence, which are some really interesting information from the field of social psychology. And we also want to talk about conflict resolution. So just kind of shift your mind a little bit away from the nuts and bolts of progress monitoring to information about people skills. So we'll kind of talk about a little bit about social influence and social power. And this was a really interesting topic for me to learn about back when Bill and I became interested in consultation and thinking about the skills that effective consultants have as they work with other adults. So remember, the focus of the information that we have to share more on how do adults work with each other to support children in inclusive environments, and topics related to social influence, which is a change in the behavior or attitude or belief, attitude, or behavior of a person that results from the action of someone else, or social power, which is the ability to bring about changes using available resource, or social power strategies, which are different types of resources that you use to bring about change. This is a totally different topic, and I think you'll find it interesting and helpful, and hope that you take some time to kind of reflect on it and reflect on your own experiences in this regard as either someone who uses their powers or has been influenced by other people who have used their powers of persuasion. And we don't care. Oh, I think this is the slide that might be redundant.
Go right by it. Yeah.
I'm going to skip that.
Yep.
Okay. So there are different types of social power, and we absolutely don't care if you remember what these are. I think the important part is for you to realize that there are different reasons and different types of social power or persuasion strategies that people use, either consciously or unconsciously, to help someone adopt something. And we'll, a little bit later on, the next few slides, we'll talk about positive social power behaviors or social power strategies and negative social power strategies. So the first three are more positive in nature. And so as you are trying to, again, use your powers of persuasion to help someone see what you want them to see, one of the important strategies that you can use is an informational strategy. And that involves the ability to rationally persuade someone using sound information. And we do that a lot in our professional roles as we work with others who don't have that formal training and experience. The next type of social power is an expert power, and so the ability to persuade someone based on one's expertise in the field. I'm more likely to listen to my medical doctor or my doctor because I know that she has medical training and she has a lot of expertise in that field. And so if I'm going to listen to anyone, I'm going to listen to her. Referent power is the ability to persuade someone based on the fact that the individual likes and admires the person who's making the request. So a referent power might be somebody who is, let's say, a skilled occupational therapist and is talking to someone who's just learning about occupational therapy. And the skilled OT is going to be able to persuade that person because the beginning OT wants to reach that status as well. Coercive power, on the other hand, is more negative in nature. The ability to persuade someone due to the threat of punishment. Reward power is the flip side of that. The ability to persuade someone due to the hope of a reward. And the important thing to know when we're talking about social power and influence is that regardless of what you think about it, these are strategies that people use all the time. And they may be strategies that someone believes someone else is using, or they may be strategies that that person is actually using. But so whether it's implied or whether it's explicit, they can be strategies that you can think about and use when you're working with other people. So there's also, in the research on social power and influence, there's also this idea of legitimate power. Legitimate power is based on societal norms. So it's the right to ask for something based on one's position or job title. So if Suzanne asks for something as being somebody who represents early childhood special ed at the state level, you're probably more likely to do it than somebody who doesn't have that position or job title. The reciprocity norm, if somebody does something for you, you return the favor. A lot of times, so let's say we're talking about progress monitoring. The itinerant teacher or the itinerant professional has gone out of his or her way to provide supports and provide resources for the classroom teacher about helping children. And then the itinerant teacher maybe asks something of the gen ed teacher to take some data or to help with something. That would be an example of city. The equity norm, the belief that people are expected to help others get what they deserve. So I think that's really important when we talk about special education, that as teachers, and it's all something, we're in the field of education because we want to help other people. And so sometimes we do things just because we believe that we want to help and this will help. children or students. Or social responsibility norm. People are expected to help those who depend on them. So the itinerant teacher might help the classroom teacher do some things because she's responsible to that classroom teacher. So there's some really interesting evidence on social power, and it comes from the field of school psychology. There may be one or two school psychologists in the mix here. I can't quite remember, but and if so, if you're a school psychologist, this is probably not new information to you. But there was a study done on research on social power and influence, and a perception of the effectiveness. They asked school consultants or school psychologists to rate the likelihood that a specific strategy would be effective. And then they asked teachers to rate the likelihood that that same strategy would be effective when the school psychologists used it. And so what they found was the softer power strategies, the more positive power strategies. So doing things like being an expert and demonstrating your expertise through a positive expert power strategy, or providing good quality information about why to use a perspective strategy, was perceived as more effective by both teachers and consultants, and they were perceived as more likely to be used by consultants than those negative kinds of strategies. So I think the take-home message, and this is a very short topic, very short piece of information about social power and influence, something we wanted you to be aware of, and we'll also post some information about that in the Edmodo site. We have a paper that was published in Young Exceptional Children about social power and influence. And the important take-home message is that social power and influence is something that people use, whether they mean to use it or not. And oftentimes it's perceived, it can be perceived positive or negative. And it's really important for you to be aware of the implications of that. So, if you say something like, wow, why don't you take these data to monitor this kid's progress, and we'll go out for lunch afterwards. What's the implication of that message that the consultant is trying to send? Or some other kinds of examples that I'm sure you can come up with. Questions or comments about that? When the first time we wrote
let me interrupt you just for a second. I think that point you made is important for people to think about as they interact with other people outside of the profession, general education, teachers and the like, in a consulting role. We need to understand what you pointed out, that some people unintentionally or intentionally use these particular strategies. And on the other side of the equation is unintentionally, some of us respond to these strategies. We expect to respond to some of these strategies. So the dynamics are very interesting. And yeah, we're not advocating that you use this to manipulate people. What we're suggesting is that it occurs, and that people either expect it or respond to it.
Yep. When we first wrote about this topic, before our papers were published, the reviewers gave us reviews like, it's terrible to think about people who are intentionally using these strategies to up the ante, that to increase the odds that somebody's going to do something. But as Bill said, the important message to think about is that these are strategies that are used unconsciously as well as consciously. And it's something that when you're working through a consultative approach to itinerant services, you really need to be cognizant of the fact of the way of how people are perceiving what you say and what you do.
And with respect to positive expert power, one other note was a number of years ago, we completed a national survey, basically asking early childhood partners who were recipients of itinerant consultation services, how they viewed the itinerant in terms of what their expectations were. And the summary was, we don't need any more friends. When somebody shows up in our classroom as an expert, we expect they know more about it than we do. We're not offended if they decide to share that information with us. It's all about how they share the information. So you need to understand, if you get sent out on a mission to some general education classroom to help some teacher, detoxify an IEP, she expects you know more about special ed than she does. And she's going to be grossly disappointed if you dance around that and don't share that knowledge and expertise with her.
Yep. A lot of the folks that we've talked to who are itinerant staff, either by choice or because that was the only job available in the district, have kind of talked about that they're really afraid that people will see them as a know-it-all, somebody who's coming into a classroom and expounding on a certain topic, or being perceived as a know-it-all. I think that's a term that we all use. There's a big difference between being perceived as a know-it-all and being perceived as an expert. And as Bill said, it's all in how you share that information and your approach to providing consultative services.
Yeah. One other quick side story. I had a guy who used to do a lot of work at my house. He was extremely good and he wasn't cheap. And so I did a little drawing. I redesigned my basement in terms of the utility tub and the appliances and whatever from its current plumbing. And I showed it to this guy, Chris, and he said, I'll do that for you. He said, it's going to cost you about $2,000 more than my diagram. And he showed me the way he would plumb it. And he said, what do you think? I said, I'll go with your diagram. Okay. So the point being, sometimes we just need to defer to people who are experts.
And it's okay to be an expert. It's good to be an expert, and it's good to find ways to share that expertise in a positive manner, so that people, so that you're approachable and people see you as someone who is there to support you. So the next topic related to these people skills is kind of thinking about your own interpersonal style and how you work with others. And we're going to talk specifically about conflict resolution. And, I was a psychology major as an undergrad, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is always such an interesting topic to me. Conflict resolution. Different ways that when you're involved with someone else or you're involved as part of the team, how you approach problems, how you approach situations, and how do you move from point A to point B. This is probably a lesson that every member of Congress should know. I'll put my political beliefs out there. I think that it's really important for you to have a good understanding of the pros and cons of different approaches to conflict resolution. So one of the approaches, I'm sorry, this is based on information from Friend and Cook, and they wrote a very popular textbook, Collaboration Skills for School Professionals, and identified different types of conflict resolution strategies. And one of the things I really liked about this approach was that they identified pros and cons, different ways of addressing conflicts, and the fact that you don't always have to use one approach consistently, that it really depends on the nature of the conflict as how you're going to respond to it. So one of the approaches that they talked about was somebody who works at accommodating or satisfying other people. There are probably a number of people on the webinar tonight who kind of see themselves as people who are pretty much accommodators. You're pretty much somebody who's going to sacrifice the way that you feel or your approach for the belief of somebody else. The pros of using accommodation as a conflict resolution strategy is that it can be really useful if it's a small issue or if it's something that you're not going to be able to change anyway. It brings the conflict to an end quickly. So if it's something that doesn't have a high priority or something that you don't see as having the ability to change, then go with what the other person might be suggesting is the way to go. On the flip side, always taking an accommodating approach to conflict resolution risks feeling taken advantage of. If you're always saying, well, we'll do it the way you want us to do it, that might start not feeling very good as a team player. And you might actually have the best answer and it's not taken into consideration. So, when you're involved with an IEP team, thinking about how you can best support children, understanding this style of conflict resolution can be really helpful. I think a lot of us, if we could do a raise of hands, and I know we can't, a lot of us tend to try to avoid conflict and try to ignore it, sometimes at all costs. There are pros to that, to avoiding conflict. It can be temporarily, it can be useful is if the issue is serious and or if it's really laden with a lot of emotions, just kind of breezing through it and not addressing it is something that you could do. On the downside, though, on the flip side, you're not dealing with a situation that really needs to be addressed. So, if you're a person who consistently works to avoid conflict, that can it can help you progress through a relationship, but that comes at costs that you may or may not want to deal with. Again, one of the things to remember thinking about using an avoidance strategy in terms of avoiding conflict is that there are times that you have the best answer than anybody else. And if you don't feel comfortable bringing it up, if you're always trying to avoid conflict, then you're not doing the best you can for kids and families. Collaboration. Collaboration is working together to reach a solution. It's probably one of the strategies that we value the most. It often results in new solutions that are acceptable to everybody, and they're results that have long-lasting solutions. So collaboration is really a great way of approaching conflict resolution. However, it takes a lot of time. And it's predicated on trust. In order to have a collaborative way of conflict resolution, you have to know who the other person is and where they're coming from. And that may not always be possible. It's football season, so some of you are probably, when you look at conflict resolution, you think about a competitive approach to conflict resolution. The name of the game is to win at all costs. It's helpful if you're dealing with an ethical issue and you know that you're right. And sometimes though that's the case, that you know that this is the way that you have to go, you know you're right. On the other hand, it can be a detraction from effective partnerships if you overuse it. People might start avoiding you. It can start damaging collaborative relationships. And let's face it, usually in our field, there's usually not a right or wrong answer to what we do. There are different approaches and different ways of doing things. Oops. And finally, the last one that we want to talk about is compromising approach. And in this approach to conflict resolution, you kind of win some and you lose some. So yes, we'll do it this way. We'll do this part this way if you can do the other part my way. And usually in terms of pros and cons, the outcome is acceptable to everybody. It's useful when time is an issue. It's useful when an issue is of lesser importance, and it can be useful if both of the people or all the people on the team are very competitive. I can't help but thinking about the recent election when I'm thinking about all of this information to conflict resolution. From the flip side, it can be a drawback. Using a compromising approach to conflict resolution can be a drawback because then nobody is completely pleased with the outcome. You might be able to accept it, but you're not happy about it. Additional conflict might occur later on, and whatever solution you may come up with may not be the best solution because you've compromised away a lot of the parts of this situation that you think are important. So again, take home, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. There are some really interesting scales of conflict resolution that we'll post in the Edmotive site and have you think about it. I think it's important as you're working with other people that you're aware of what your style of conflict resolution is, and that you're also aware of what the style is of the other people on your team. Comments or questions about that? Bill, anything to add?
No, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. So here's just another graphic, and I think you probably know a lot of these people. Tailoring approaches to address the conflict. That again, you need to know who the person is that you're working with, and you need to know where they come from in terms of conflict resolution. This is an interesting graphic that kind of talks about how you can look at problem solving and professional support via the development of partnerships. So a progression to partnership. Again, we talked about social power and influence strategies. We talked about conflict resolution. They're all aspects of dealing with partnerships that people need to take into account. This is a graphic that we actually had a friend of ours, a colleague, develop that I know, Bill, I'm supposed to talk about this, but you're better at talking about it. So would you mind?
Sure, no. Okay. Yeah, follow the bouncing balls. It's come to our attention over the millennia of working with itinerant teachers and studying the landscape that partnerships develop over time, and they develop as a result of a lot of different characteristics, but there seems to be some stages. So we identified 5 stages in partnership. The first stage is called cultivating awareness. That has to do with the nature of the partnership. We're going to actually quickly look at a couple of the organizational administrative issues that will help with this cultivating awareness. You know, at this particular point, we're helping a general education teacher who may be familiar with the push-in model, where she's had a visitor who comes to the classroom and just works with the child in the corner. We're helping the community, the general ed community and parents begin to understand how a consultation relationship is different. In the introduction phase, that's quite literally the introduction of the consultant to the partner teacher. The next stage is called rapport building, RB, which is an extremely critical phase of interpersonal relationships. And you know, that is the interactions, the quality of the interactions between the consultant and the gen ed partner. The way that we transfer knowledge and skills, the way that we interact respectfully with partners, which moves us to the fourth stage, which is comfort and confidence, where as a result of this systematic transfer of knowledge and skills in a respectful process of consultation, the partner teacher is more comfortable and confident in her ability to address the IEP needs of this child. And the last stage is the development of a partnership, which is clearly professional and often can be personal as well, depending on the nature of the relationship over 9 months or 2 years or the like. The color scheme of the different phases, of the different components and the phases, suggests that in the initial phase 1, I'm pointing on my screen, not that helps you, in phase 1, cultivating awareness is darker because that's the main thrust of phase 1. When we move to phase 2, cultivating awareness is fading a bit, and now we're in the introduction phase. As we move to phase 3, cultivating awareness is no longer a main issue. Introduction is behind us, and we're beginning to build rapport. As we move to stage 4, cultivating awareness and introduction pretty much faded out. We're well beyond that. We're expanding rapport, and we're now building comfort and confidence. When we get to stage 5, rapport building is strong, has resulted in greatly improved and noticeable comfort and confidence, and has resulted in a partnership. So, the point being, the focus of the partnership is the benefit to the child, but along the way, we develop professional relationships and personal relationships, which can become bigger than the sum of its parts, so to speak. But there's a dynamic. Before we move on, what I could say about consulting, from the rear seat, is that it's extremely complex, but not in a bad way. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's your personal confidence and your personal competence as a special educator. There's your interpersonal communication skills. There's your personal organization skills. There's your professional organization skills. So there's the administrative overlay. There is the social awareness kinds of principles Lori just mentioned. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. To the untrained eye, it looks easy. But when you step back a bit and look, we've always, when we look at the military metaphor, we consider consultants to be the Marine Corps of the military, okay? This is where the boots really hit the ground. This is, to us, this is one of the more complicated roles in the world of education, serving as a consultant. So this is a schematic here, just describes how partnerships progress and what seem to be the key stages in the partnership.
Thank you. I know you do a better job than I do. Yeah, and I know Bill's going to talk in a minute about administrative challenges and logistics, but it's important to know that a progression to partnership is not going to be the same across the partners. There are lots of different factors that are going to affect the ability to develop a partnership. You may have people that have personal characteristics and different approaches to teaching and learning that are different to yours. And so when that occurs, that's going to influence how well you have the ability to develop that partnership. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bill. He's going to talk a little bit about challenges in adopting a consultative model in itinerant services.
Yeah, and what an interesting photo, huh?
I know, but I love that one.
The preface to this next section is that all of this information is either in the book, in the text, as well as the appendix in the book, and it's also in the Edmodo folder. These are basically breadcrumbs we've left you to follow. Administrative support is absolutely essential. Public awareness of a consultation model is essential. And we're just going to talk briefly about a few of the tools. And once again, you can examine these in great detail and also can download and edit and do what you'd like with any of the templates if they're if you find them to be of interest and value as you move down the road to consultation. So the first thing is the shot across the bow. People need to understand, as we're moving to a consultation model, things are different than they used to be in the direct service push-in model. And that shouldn't be a well-guarded secret. That should be public information for everybody who's involved in the consultation process. Next slide, Lori. And one of the ways we advocate that you make this public is by communicating through letter, through an official correspondence to the key players, the stakeholders involved in the consultation model. Next slide, Lori. These slides need to be, or this kinds of information needs to be initiated by the school principal, the special education director, the Part B coordinator, whoever is in charge of the itinerant consultation model, needs to take it upon herself or himself to announce publicly the direction the district is headed and what are going to be the different responsibilities of the key players in the consultation model. As I mentioned, these form letters are in your folders. They're also in the book. I'm not going to go through them, but this is a letter. Oh, I can't see the top. It's a letter to the parents from the itinerant consultant. Very important to communicate to parents so they understand what the consultation model is going to look like, because most parents don't know the model. They just know the direct instruction model. And what they understand is the more therapy services, for example, I can get, the better. The more one-to-one instruction I get, is the better. Parents need to begin to understand that's not necessarily true. We need to help the teacher who's spending, or the child care provider who's spending more time with your children, how to support your child's IEP objectives in order to be more successful. Next slide, Lori. Yeah, this is the letter to the partner teacher from the itinerant, Sarah Albright in this case. Next slide, Lori. District supervisor to pre-K director. The big guns are out now, right? But you need that, okay? You need that administrative support. You do not want to be a covert agent. Next slide. Yeah, so there are basic components, and you can read through these later on at your leisure, but it's basically a description of what the service will be. This is who's going to provide the service. This is the person's qualifications. This is what the service model should look like. These are the expectations with respect to interaction with the partner teacher, the transfer of knowledge and skills to the partner teacher, the expectation that the partner teacher will work with our consultant so that she better understands how to address the child's IP objectives. Okay, don't hold back, make it straightforward. But the point of the matter is, once again, public communication of the model of consultation and how things will differ in a consultation model from traditional practice. Next slide, please. Yeah, some discussion about frequency and duration of visits. Of course, from day 1 to day 180, that can change, but that's fine. We have to have a starting point in terms of general expectations. You're not going to be there 5 days a week. We can be assured of that. Next slide, please. Okay, plans to communicate with parents. Once again, leave no stone unturned in this formal agreement. Next slide, please. This is once again just a sample of a letter of agreement. We don't call them contracts because that gets people concerned, and they're not really enforceable contracts, but they certainly are effective in outlining for receiving programs what the expectations are and how the model will differ, because we have to assume most Head Start programs are not really familiar with the kind of consultation model we're talking about. And it's our responsibility to help them better understand how that model will work. And we do this through formal communications. We also obviously have informal communications, but initially, to set this relationship up, we need to have some kind of letter of agreement or announcement of the form and focus of consultation services. Next slide, Lori. Yeah, what are the challenges in planning for consultation? Next slide, please. There are 2 forms we're going to recommend here, and there are others floating around there in the internet. But the simple point being, we think it's advisable to document what your plan for coaching or consultation is, how that coaching or consultation went. And you should keep these chronically dated logs for lots of purposes. One is to demonstrate the effectiveness and the growth of the consultation relationship. And from the administrative perspective, it allows your supervisor and director to report to the administration if they have any concerns about exactly what goes on during these consultation sessions. So these are a win-win type document. We advocate something that just can work with a checklist Not a lot of anecdotal notes, just simply straightforward kinds of information. And once again, these templates are available in the book and on the Edmodo site. Next slide, Lori.
Yeah. One thing that really worked for Mesa School District is when they finally decided to provide some specific time during the week, each week, for these consultation sessions between all the educators that are working on behalf of the children. And so
Excellent.
having a form like this would really help to make that possible, because then they could document, okay, so you are talking about this, it is having a positive effect. It's more than, just everybody getting together and talking about Timmy. It's
Yeah.
really about specific,
Yep.
that we're going to be going over these things. So.
Yeah. And, once again, if you have a consultant who's working with 3 or 4 kids or 3 or 4 different gen ed teachers, this helps her keep track of what's cooking with this particular child. What's going to happen when I make my visit on Thursday? This is her guide. So was Kathy Eubanks behind that? Is that the name I remember from Mesa?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good for her.
Use
Next
it.
slide, please, Lori.
Mhm.
Yeah, and this is another way of a weekly planning document. Same deal. Not too much in those boxes. Okay, so pretty straightforward. But once again, next week, short week, 2 days or 3 days, whatever's going down there in Arizona. But in a typical week, this will give you some idea who I'm visiting and what I'm doing from Monday to Thursday to Friday. Next slide, Lori. Yeah, once again, we have the new book, which when it comes out has there's a whole lot of detailed discussion about this kinds of stuff. But just to point out, there are logistical issues. They need to be understood. They won't take you by surprise, and you'll work your way through them. Next slide. Yep. Let's just blow through these last 3 or 4. People can look at those and get to the pieces. Like I said, everything's in the appendix or in the folder, so it should be easy to take a look at and digest. There you go.
So this last part, and we have about 2 minutes to share information, could be really helpful for those of you who are looking to find ways of supporting itinerant staff. We developed the PIECES, which is an acronym for Performance Indicators for Itinerant Early Childhood Education Specialists. Because when we started out, we understood that districts and LEAs had no differential way to evaluate or provide support to staff who served as consultants, as opposed to staff who served as classroom teachers. And the job as somebody who travels from classroom to classroom providing consultation is very different than the job of somebody who is a classroom teacher. We enlisted the support of itinerant teachers and their supervisors and directors to really look at how we could provide some kind of a tool that could support that evaluation from a positive perspective. And the pieces, it's in at the end of your book. It consists of 3 parts. Part A reflects the requisite knowledge and skills related to early childhood special ed service delivery. So it's everything that is special about your job as a special educator or a related service provider, or even if you're providing general education consultation to that. Part B focuses on communication skills and specialized knowledge related to coaching and information sharing. And then part C really focuses on service coordination. How do you coordinate all of these things? Because as an itinerant professional, you're usually the person whose job it is to coordinate all the different types of services. Each part is organized around specific performance indicators that are described with the use of observable objectives. We developed a rubric, a continuum of rubrics that's basic, proficient, or distinguished. And at the end, there's a 2-page checklist that provides an easy to read overview of the itinerant teacher or itinerant professionals' performance in each of those areas. And we really think that using this can be a way of helping staff to develop professional development plans and understanding what they need from a supervisory perspective to be the most effective kind of consultant that they can be. Part A, itinerant staff need to know their stuff. If you're an OT, you need to know about OT stuff. If you're a special educator, you need to know about special education stuff. But you also need to know about the organizational context of the child's environment. So if you're consulting in a Head Start setting, you need to know the Head Start performance standards. You need to be able to, that's important because it's the context under which you're providing services. In terms of coaching and information sharing, here's some information about what you need to know. And finally, under Part C, not IDEA Part C of pieces, you need to know about how to coordinate and facilitate integrated service delivery. And one of the things that we found in our work with itinerant teachers is that many times itinerant staff are tasked with designing and implementing professional development activities for other teachers that they work with.
Lori, I can say that Shara from Dysart, religiously uses that pieces rubric to help them to, monitor the progress of their program. So it's really about the program design of the itinerant model. And so she has told us that this has been very helpful.
That's great. That really is helpful. Yeah, I think you absolutely have to distinguish the role of consultant from the role of a classroom-based educator.
Yeah, the next number of slides we're not going to go through, but they're just benchmarks, so to speak, as your program moves from stage 1 to stage 5, and you can look at macro and micro indicators of progress. There's several pages of these. Once again, just something to glance at to reassure yourselves that you are making progress and what kind of indicators might support that. And
that good teachers always overplan, so we've overplanned.
And they're in the obviously you guys are high quality readers, and once again they're buried there in the slideshow and in the folders.
So here's a really important point. It's the last time we're going to talk to all of you together. As you work towards implementation, don't try and do everything perfectly. Don't wait until you feel like you have everything perfectly lined up, because you're never going to start if you do that.
Yeah.
So taking baby steps and piloting, we've talked about that in the coaching sessions. Trying some stuff out is really how you get moving in this model.
Yeah, and the model is, as we've said, it is complex, but it is not complicated. You can retro engineer it. There's a bunch of pieces and you can pull them on out and take a look at them.
And we're not done with you yet. The last week in November, the very first week in December, we'll have our final coaching sessions.
Yeah, and enjoy your socially distanced Thanksgiving, whatever your plans are in Arizona.
Well, Bill and Lori, we appreciate you so much, and thank you for this, our 4th cohort of the itinerant model training. People have been using your model and been very successful with it. So I just hope that, we can keep this relationship going and even capitalize on some new ways of offering this. So appreciate your work with us and your knowledge and experience, and been so valuable for all of us.
We've really
Thank you.
enjoyed it as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And happy
Okay.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Yes.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
So I love this last slide here. So I was going to post that in Edmodo too. It's such a pretty picture.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Well, I guess we will talk to everybody soon. Hope you have
Yeah.
a great Thanksgiving, and
Yeah.
we'll sign off, and I will stop the recording and talk to you maybe at one of our at our conference. Hope to see you virtually anyway.
Great. Thanks,
Yeah. Good
everybody.
night.
Have a good evening.
Take